Attempt. Why did Jesus never teach Sabbath-keeping to Gentiles? Answer. Jesus did teach the Sabbath to Gentiles, and he upheld it for all people. Skeptics claim that Jesus never taught Sabbath-keeping to Gentiles, implying that the Sabbath was only for Jews. However, this claim is false. 1. Jesus declared the Sabbath was made for all humanity, not just Jews. Mark 2:27-28, KJV. And he said unto them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Key points. Jesus did not say the Sabbath was made for Jews. He said it was made for man. Greek, anthropos, ixus, all humanity. The Sabbath was established at creation, Genesis 2:2-3, before there were any Jews or Gentiles, proving it was intended for all people. If Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, then the Sabbath still belongs to him and remains relevant. 2. Jesus expected future Gentile believers to keep the Sabbath, Matthew 24:20, KJV. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Context. Jesus was warning about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, nearly 40 years after his resurrection. If the Sabbath was abolished, why would Jesus instruct his followers, including Gentiles in the early church, to pray that they do not flee on the Sabbath? This proves Jesus expected his followers, Jews and Gentiles, to still be keeping the Sabbath long after his ascension. 3. Jesus taught the Sabbath by his example, Luke 4:16, KJV. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. Key points. Jesus had a consistent practice of keeping the Sabbath. He taught by example. His disciples, both Jews and Gentiles, would follow what he did. If Jesus planned to abolish the Sabbath, he would have told his disciples, but he never did. 4. Jesus preached the gospel to Gentiles, and he did not change the Sabbath. Some skeptics argue that Jesus only taught Sabbath-keeping to Jews. However, Jesus preached to Gentiles multiple times. John chapter 4:39-42. Jesus taught the Samaritan woman, and many Samaritans believed in him. Matthew 8:5-13. Jesus healed the Roman centurion's servant and praised his great faith. Mark 5:1-20. Jesus healed the Gentile demoniac and told him to spread the news. Matthew 15:21-28. Jesus helped the Canaanite woman, showing his mission extended beyond Israel. If Jesus was willing to teach salvation, faith, and righteousness to Gentiles, why would he hide the Sabbath from them? He never indicated that the Sabbath was only for Jews. 5. The early church continued teaching the Sabbath to Gentiles. If Jesus had abolished the Sabbath for Gentiles, his disciples would have done the same. However, the early church continued keeping and teaching the Sabbath, especially to Gentiles. Acts 13:42-44, KJV. And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And the next Sabbath day came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. Key points. Gentiles asked Paul to preach to them on the Sabbath. They were clearly observing it. If the Sabbath had been replaced by Sunday, Paul could have invited them to meet the next day, Sunday, but he didn't. Acts 16:13, KJV. And on the Sabbath we went out of the city by a riverside, where prayer was wont to be made. And we sat down, and spake unto the women which resorted thither. Acts 18:4, KJV. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. The fact that Gentiles were keeping the Sabbath in the early church proves that Jesus never taught its abolition. 6. The Sabbath was part of God's moral law, not a temporary Jewish law. Some argue that the Sabbath was only part of the Jewish ceremonial law, but the Bible proves otherwise. Genesis 2:2-3, KJV. The Sabbath was instituted at creation, long before Israel existed. Exodus 20:8-11, KJV. The Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments, which are universal moral laws, not just Jewish ordinances. Revelation 14:12, KJV. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. God's faithful people in the last days still keep his commandments, including the Sabbath. Conclusion: Jesus did teach the Sabbath to Gentiles. Through word and example, Jesus declared the Sabbath was made for all humanity. Mark 2:27. He expected his followers, including future Gentile believers, to still observe it. Matthew chapter 24:20. Jesus personally kept and upheld the Sabbath. Luke 4:16. He preached to Gentiles and never told them the Sabbath was abolished. The early church continued to teach the Sabbath to Gentiles. Acts 13:42-44, Acts 18:4. The claim that Jesus never taught the Sabbath to Gentiles is false. The Sabbath was never abolished. It remains God's holy day for all people.